seated. Well, welcome to Mercyview. In a new place this morning, but for some of us, this is a familiar place. If you don't know part of our story, we were here for about 3 years when the COVID shutdown happened. And we have been in a few different places, but in the Lord's providence has brought us back to where we were. And man, it has been such a sweet couple of days. In particular, yesterday morning, a bunch of folks came to kind of help get things set up for today. And the folks here at Wilson were gracious enough to let us leave everything up last night, so we didn't have to get up and do too much this morning. But this is a really special moment in the life of our church, and I think it's very important for us to recognize that. This is the next page really of God's story for us. Though it may be a familiar place for some of us, what the Lord is doing among us in a lot of ways is turning the page and saying this next season of ministry, this next season of life that you're going to have among you as a church, in part, as far as it relates to where we gather for worship, is going to be in this part of the city. It's going to be in this part of Tulsa, and I want to see my kingdom come through you here. We've been talking about that actually over the last few weeks, what it looks like for us to be on mission in the places where we live and work and play, and we can add to that where we worship. I'm excited to see what the Lord wants to do among us in that way. So, special morning, y'all. My name is Brad. I'm one of the pastors here. If you're visiting with us this morning, honored you're here. I hope you've been encouraged by your time in worship so far. I want to do something too real quick. We need to say a bunch of thank yous, and I'm going to do my best to try to remember everyone here. But there has been a lot of work to get ready for this day. And so I want to just commend and honor a bunch of folks, if you don't mind. First, probably the person who has done the most work behind the scenes to get us ready for this day, Mr. Trey Hopkins. Let's give a hand to Trey. Yeah. In seen and unseen ways, brother, you have served this church so well. Thank you for all that you've done. And Trey has done just an amazing job. A lot has happened because of him. I want to thank Nikki, who's also on staff with us at Mercyview. I think is she here? Yeah, there's Nikki. Yeah. Also, Nikki has done so much to help us get ready for this day. I want to thank Jamie Neiman and the Mercyview Kids team. Mercyview Kids is rocking and rolling this morning because of them. Yeah. I want to thank Andrew Peruzzi and Jacob Sweat for all the work that they've done to get us ready for worship stuff. Yeah. I want to thank Andy Connell and the AV team for all the work that they have done to get us ready, make us sound good and look good. And I want to thank other folks and other teams, Jerry and Jama, and their work with the welcome team getting us ready for today. Thank you, guys. I want to thank Dax. I think I saw Tyler over here for all y'all's work with getting our kind of security and ops team together. Thank you, guys. And a lot of that has to do with kind of what helped get us ready for this moment to be together for a worship gathering. But there's been so much work done leading up to this by other groups of people. For example, I don't know if you would think of it this way, but the stewardship team actually is a group of folks who have helped us think really well about what our next step should be as we make like fiscally responsible decisions. And part of the reason that we're here this morning is because they helped us see some of that in a very helpful way. And I'm so proud of the work that they've done. Can we give the stewardship team a hand as well? Yeah. Yeah. And then everyone that came yesterday, man, I pulled up here and a lot of folks were already here, and we were congregating outside by the trailer. And by the way, you've probably seen some of the new branding. We've got a new look, and that was something that was, I knew it. I'd already seen it, obviously, but coming up to the trailer and seeing it on the side of the trailer for the first time in person, seeing our folks just there. There were probably 40 or 50 folks here ready to go yesterday. Thank you for everybody that came yesterday to help us get ready for today. Can we give those folks a hand as well? Yeah. And there have been, I'm sure, countless moments over these past few months as we've prepared for this that some of you who are spouses have sacrificed time away from your spouse so that they could help prepare for this. And I just want to say to you how grateful I am. I'm hoping that will even out a little bit on the other side of this move. But you all have sacrificed so much, and I just wanted to say thank you to you as well. All right. So in the front yard of the Andrews homestead are two trees. One is an apple tree. I've told you about that apple tree before. It's growing slowly but surely. And next to our driveway is another smaller tree. I'm not exactly sure what kind of tree it is, but it's a tree that has red berries on it, or at least it did. We've lived in our home for about 5 years. And in our 5 years there, in fact, when we moved there, both of those trees were beautiful and growing and flourishing. But something has happened over these 5 years, and one tree is flourishing and the other isn't. It's the apple tree. The apple tree is doing great. It's growing apples. But over time, the other smaller red berry tree next to our driveway has started to decline. And for some reason, in the past, I think 6 to 9 months, it looks as if it has completely died. And what's happened over the last few years is I would notice a branch would be dead, and we would, saw that off and thinking, well, if we get that branch that doesn't have life off of the tree tree will kind of perk up. But then another branch would die, and we would saw that off. And almost half of the tree, if you look at it at an angle, is not there because we've taken dead branches off. Well, for whatever reason, again, over the last few months, we've noticed that the entire tree is not flourishing at all. There's nothing growing. It is, you can just tell by the way that you look at it, it's graying. There's nothing growing on the branches. Something is wrong with that tree. Now, here's the deal. For the most part, both of those trees are in the same place. They're in the front yard. They're not that far apart. You would think that the conditions that are necessary for a tree to flourish in the front yard would be true for both of those trees. But for some reason, and really it's a mystery to me, one tree is flourishing and the other tree is not. In our spiritual lives, the conditions for how we flourish also matters greatly. The conditions for how we flourish as followers of Jesus matters. What we bring into our lives, what we are planted in, what we water our lives with either leads to thriving or hopelessness. It either leads to growth or many times despair. We are beginning a new 3-week series this morning called Essential. We do this every year, typically at this time, to remind ourselves of the 3 big values that drive us as a church. It's good for us to be reminded of those things, right? And today we're looking at the first value, but the first value you could really say is the value that sits underneath all of the values. And you're going to see what that is here in just a moment. But as we do that this morning, as we look at this first value, I want to invite you to see 2 things. The first is this: our failure to keep the law makes us guilty. Our failure to keep the law makes us guilty. And second, Jesus redeems our failure through the gospel. Jesus redeems our failure through the gospel. So if you have your Bibles or electronic devices, keep them open to Matthew 5. That's where we're going to be. We're actually going to do something a little different. We're going to look at this passage in reverse. And the reason why is because actually as we look at this passage in reverse, we're going to understand the flow of what Jesus is trying to communicate to us. But first, a little context. If you're familiar with this passage, you know that this is a part of a larger section in Matthew called the Sermon on the Mount. And if you know anything about the Sermon on the Mount, you know that this is the longest discourse that Jesus gives in his Gospels. We're actually just 1 chapter away from the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. So this is one of the first things that Jesus wanted to communicate to help people understand, like, this is why I've come. This is how I would want you to live. And so this is a very important passage that's coming at the very beginning of the ministry of Jesus. You may remember the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus begins with this series of statements that are known as the Beatitudes, right? Blessed, for example, are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And he has others, but this comes right after that, essentially. So look with me, if you would, beginning at the end of our passage that you just heard read, verse 21. Let me read that again as we get started. Here's what Jesus says. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. So what Jesus is doing here is taking one of the 10 commandments from the Old Testament, and he's going to tell us how we should think of that commandment and how that affects how we should live. He does this kind of thing actually throughout the Sermon on the Mount. He takes a commandment given in the Old Testament, and he sets an even higher standard or benchmark for the follower of Jesus with it. And the first one that he tackles in the Sermon on the Mount is this one. He says, you shall not kill. Right? We know, if you are familiar with the 10 Commandments, you know that is one of the 10 Commandments. But Jesus then says this about the commandment. He says, you've heard it said that you shall not murder. In other words, Jesus is saying, I know that you've heard that commandment, thou shalt not kill. But I want to say to you something else about that now. If you are angry or insult your brother or sister and call them a fool, you shall be liable. That's what it says in the ESV. What is Jesus talking about here? Like he seems to be connecting the heart motive to the external action, right? He seems to be saying that if inside of you are angry or you are insulting a brother or sister or even calling them a fool in your heart, that it is sinful. He's upping the ante here. He is actually setting, it seems, an even higher benchmark for you and I as followers of Jesus. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, Brad, wasn't Jesus angry with people? Right? Does Jesus actually apply this to his own life? You may remember the scene where Jesus gets angry with the money changers in the temple, right? He's flipping tables. And now this hasn't taken place yet in the life of Jesus in our story, but it is a fair question. There was coming a time where Jesus was going to get angry, flip the tables in the temple, and call out the money changers. And what about calling someone a fool? The idea of a fool in the Bible is definitely a category. It's all over Proverbs. Jesus even calls the Pharisees fools later in this book in Matthew 23. So what is Jesus saying here? What kind of anger violates this commandment? Well, the reason why Jesus is so serious here is that he is saying there is a type of anger that is not righteous, but sinful. And if unconfessed, is a sign of something very seriously wrong with that person's heart. Maybe even indicating that they don't know Jesus. Let me get at it this way. In the original languages, the phrase "you fool" that we just read in this passage is the word raka. R-A-C-A. Raka literally means you are nothing. So that little phrase in the ESV that says "you fool," I think it's in the King James. You'll see that word raka there because it's a really hard word to translate. But what it is translated as is you saying to someone else, either with your voice or with your heart, you are nothing. And here's what Jesus is doing. He is making the point that to call someone this is actually more than an insult. It is a deep-seated heart attitude of contempt and disgust and even hatred towards someone else. Jesus, by the way, never had this kind of anger. We just asked the question, didn't Jesus get angry? Jesus' anger was always righteous anger, fully righteous. His anger arose out of love for the truth, love for people, even love for the perpetrator. You might remember when he was on the cross. That was the moment when Jesus could have said, these folks, this is an injustice for me. I shouldn't be up on this cross. These folks deserve nothing. But what did he say instead? He said, they don't know what they're doing. Please forgive them, Lord. That arose, that kind of attitude of the heart arose from a place of love, even towards those who perpetrated against Jesus. But here's the point. Our anger is not like that, right? Our anger is often filled with raka. It's filled with contempt. It's filled with disgust. It's filled with even hatred many times because it is not based in love. It's based on pride. It's based on personal offense. And here's how you can know what kind of anger your anger is. When you think of the person that you're angry with, and you enjoy the idea that they might be embarrassed or humiliated, Jesus is saying that that kind of anger is a seedbed for something. It creates the conditions for something. Just like the trees in our front yard, it creates either a flourishing tree or it creates a tree that is dying or dead. See, Jesus could have said, friends, it's bad to have a grudge. It's bad to be condescending and just left it at that. But he goes further, right? He says that this kind of attitude, don't miss this, is like murder. What does that mean? What is Jesus getting at here? Because that seems like a stretch to us, right? When we hear the 10 Commandments read to us and we hear this one, thou shalt not kill, we think, well, I'm not a murderer. I haven't killed anybody. But Jesus is doing something for us here that's really interesting. He is saying that if in your heart you have that kind of anger towards someone else, he is saying that smells like sulfur. It is hellish. That's strong, right? He's saying it's the seedbed. It's creating the conditions for something like murder. Now, that should confront you this morning, not necessarily because you would say, Brad, I haven't killed anyone physically. But none of us have anger that isn't filled with raka, with disdain or disgust or hatred. Our anger is either tinged with that or typically it is consumed with that. We are, because of that, guilty. Guilty. Now, look with me back at the beginning of verse 18. Again, we're kind of moving in reverse here, working our way back through this passage to get the flow. Let me read that again for us, beginning there in verse 18. Here's what it says. Look there. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whatever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, we just heard Jesus break down this sort of new understanding or this extent by which the commandment of not killing someone else is to be understood. He has raised the bar for us. And he says here, though, that whoever then would relax one of these commandments, who would ever take what he has now said and say, that's not a big deal. You don't have to think of it that way. They diminish that commandment or loosen that commandment. He's saying that if you do that, you'll actually be least in the kingdom. He's saying, too, if you teach others to do that, you'll be considered least in the kingdom. In other words, Jesus is not saying that it really doesn't matter how you live, as long as you have a nice relationship with me. Jesus is saying that when it comes to the law and the prophets, which is what they would have had at this time, it was the Old Testament scripture. He said that when it comes to that stuff that I've given you, your righteousness should actually surpass that of the religious leaders. Now, the original listeners would have heard Jesus say this and been absolutely shocked by this, astounded. Because the religious leaders and the Pharisees in particular, they lived like what we think of as monks live, or maybe the Amish. These sort of tightly ordered communities that live tightly ordered lives according to a whole set of kind of boundaries and rules. Now, the Pharisees had hundreds of these rules. They went far beyond the Ten Commandments in the way that they thought about how they should live. And it wasn't so much the number of rules that the Pharisees had, but it was why they had the rules. The Pharisees added rules because they thought it made them more righteous. And that meant that God would accept them, that he would love them more, that they would be in God's good graces or stay in God's good graces. But these rules would have been something that other people around the Pharisees would have known as well. And so anyone listening to what Jesus is saying here would have been absolutely confused, because they would have said to Jesus, but Jesus, how in the world do you expect us to be as righteous as them? They're doing all kinds of stuff. We don't even come close to that. How do you expect that from us? This is a lot to ask, Jesus. So Jesus goes on in verses 21 and 22. That's what we just looked at. And he basically says, well, let me show you what I'm talking about. And he gives this example of the commandment that deals with murder. But again, he expands it to talk about really any sort of anger or insult that we have in our heart towards a brother is the seedbed for that very thing. Here's what Jesus is trying to do for us. Jesus is saying, let me tell you what the law of God demands. It doesn't just demand external behavior. It doesn't just demand a certain kind of obedience that is seen only from the outside. It also demands pure and righteous inner motives. In other words, it's not just wrong for us to commit murder. I mean, that's wrong. But it's also wrong if you have the motives and attitudes of the heart that lead to that kind of thing. That's how Jesus is raising the bar on this. So that brings me to the first thing I want to invite you to see this morning. Our failure to keep the law, though, makes us guilty. If you don't feel this yet, the very kind of response that those original listeners would have had, man, that's my response this morning. It's, how do you expect me, Jesus, for my righteousness to exceed that of religious people? People who follow every law, as this passage talked about, every iota of the law. See, we're all confronted in this passage. Because really what the law demands is perfect innocence. And none of us are perfectly innocent, even with this one commandment that we're looking at here first. Again, by the way, Jesus is going to expand to a bunch of commandments in the same way throughout the Sermon on the Mount, because he doesn't want to let us out of the demand that he has that our hearts are as important, if not more, than our external actions. See, the Sermon on the Mount is a mirror that penetrates deep into our souls. And if you aren't feeling this yet, this is the part of the purpose of the Sermon on the Mount. It is to expose us for who we really are. And by the way, that's uncomfortable. The Sermon on the Mount is meant to help us see that our actions are always the end result of whatever's going on inside of us. And many times the sinful actions, or the kind of actions that don't have righteous intent, are corrupt with motivation that has a lot to do with us and not God. And Jesus did this here, and he does it throughout the Sermon on the Mount, so that there would be no question about our situation as humans. We have no ground to stand on in the face of perfection, which is what the law demands. So when faced with who we really are, we can't get around it. We cannot pretend to ignore it. Now, some of us try to do that. Most of us try to do that. We try to distract ourselves, act like maybe Jesus meant something else. But we really, I think, experience often that, man, my behavior can't save me. And if you didn't know that, I need to say that to you. You cannot depend on your relatively good behavior to save you. That's not the standard. So, because we're not perfect, because we do not keep the law in our heart, we are guilty of all of it, of breaking the entire law. And I think we all know this on some level. Romans 2:15 says it about us. Again, we may try to deny it or explain it away, but Romans 2:15 says that the requirements of the law are written on our hearts. And by the way, that's everyone, not just Christians. And this leaves us in our true place before God. If you are guilty before God for breaking one rule, it breaks all the rules, and you can't save yourself because of your behavior, you are in need. You're in need of something, and that thing is something that you can't procure for yourself. You're guilty. You're a sinner. And Jesus is holding the mirror up to us so that we will stop looking to ourselves for some sort of answer. Friend, you have no answer for the demands of the law other than, I'm guilty. Your failure to keep the law makes you guilty. Now, I want to spend most of our time here this morning. If you would, look with me back at verse 17. Again, remember, we're working in reverse here. Here's what it says again. This is Jesus speaking. Do not think that I, Jesus, have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Now, the reason that Jesus says this is because he wants to make it a point to say that he still wants you to obey the law. Don't miss that. Obeying the law or the commandments that God gives, the directives that God gives, that pleases God. Why? Because the law, the commandments, is a reflection of who God is. God is a person of integrity, right? He's a person who keeps his promises. And Jesus here is saying, I love you too much to say, forget about all that stuff. The law of God actually is a picture or a representation of God's nature. It's not just busy work. You were made to image God, to reflect God. Let me give you an example of what I mean. If the Bible says that God forgives, and you then don't forgive, what is happening? What Jesus is trying to say here is, you are violating your own design. And when you violate your own design, there will always be a breakdown. Just like if you don't change the oil in your car, there will be a breakdown, literally, right? Why? Because you're violating its design. When the mechanic tells you to do this or that, he's not giving you busy work. He's saying you need to honor the design of your vehicle so that your vehicle will thrive and not break down. So if you fail to forgive, you're not just breaking the rule. Don't think of it that way. It's failing to be like God, which means you're failing to be who you were made to be. And then when that happens, there will be breakdowns. You guys know this. Some of you are walking through this right now in your life. Some of you have walked through this in your past. Some of you, unfortunately, will likely walk through this in your future. But when unforgiveness is kind of in the atmosphere in a relationship, there will be breakdowns. There will be breakdowns in your body. Resentment does that. Hatred of someone else does that. There will be breakdowns in your family, right? There'll be breakdowns in society if enough people do it. I don't know if you've noticed yet, but there's a lot of breakdowns in our society. Not that this is the only diagnosis, but I think in part it's because there's a lot of unforgiveness. So Jesus says that he wants you to obey the law, but then he says about the law this: I came to fulfill it. This is one of the most important statements in all of the Bible. And it really helps you understand the point of the scriptures too. It gets at what is at the very heart of this church, actually. How do we fulfill the law? If we're supposed to still live this way, how do we do it? We just said we're guilty of not doing it. Well, let's think of it this way. There are always really two ways to fulfill a law. You either keep it or you pay it. There's a law that says you must stop at a stop sign here in this neighborhood, right? Many of you had to stop behind one to get here to church this morning. If you're in a vehicle and you come to a stop sign, you have to stop before proceeding. If you don't stop, what happens? You might get stopped and you might get a ticket, right? There are two ways to fulfill that law. One is to stop, right? The other is to go through the stop sign, get a ticket, and then pay the ticket. Either way, the law has been fulfilled and has no more claim on you. You've either stopped or you've paid the ticket. Now, the law of God is a life of complete love and integrity and peace and justice. And Jesus comes to earth in our place. Here's what he's saying today. And he actually fulfills the law twice. Don't miss this. First, he fulfills it by living it in his life, by obeying it perfectly. But that's not all that Jesus does. He also fulfills the law by paying the penalty for those who can't, you and me. Here's why this is good news. If Jesus had only paid the penalty for your law breaking, that would mean that your past is atoned for. Like when you believed in him, yes, you were pardoned from your sin, but now it's up to you to live a good life if you want to get to heaven. By the way, that's what most of culture and society believes. If I'm good enough, maybe God will let me into heaven someday. But Jesus not only takes our punishment, he tells us here in our passage today, he fulfills that law not once but twice. He lives the perfect life and has earned the blessings of salvation as well. And that brings me to the second thing that I want to invite you to see this morning. Jesus redeems our failure through the gospel. Here's what that means. See, when you believe in Jesus, you not only get your past forgiven, you get the reward now and forever of a perfectly obedient person. You get that reward, the love and forgiveness of God, even though you haven't been perfectly obedient. Why? Because Jesus stood in your place where you couldn't. He went to the cross to pay for our failure to be perfect. He is perfect for us. We are forgiven because of him, and we are loved because of him. When you get to the very end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says there are really just two gates or roads that you can walk in life. And Jesus does say, choose the right one. Now, most people think that what Jesus is saying there is either choose to obey God's law or choose to disobey God's law. There's the obedience road or the disobedience road. But if you walk all the way through the Sermon on the Mount, that's really not what you see that Jesus is talking about at the very end. For example, when Jesus talks about praying, he doesn't talk about people who pray and people who don't pray. He talks about people who pray and think that their many words and their outward performance in prayer will somehow merit God's favor. And then he talks about people who see prayer as a response to grace, to get more of God. In other ways, the two paths in the Bible that we are to walk on as believers are, it's not the path to earn grace. That's one path. The other is to obey God being motivated by grace or in response to grace. That's really what Jesus is trying to teach in the Sermon on the Mount. That's the way to live. That's what a flourishing Christ follower looks like. So for us this morning, that is one of the two ways for us to live. And Jesus is saying, if you know that you've been saved by grace, if you know that I have fulfilled the law, then your right living, listen, this is amazing, will exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees. How could that be? Well, first of all, grace-based righteousness is unconditional. You're doing it not because of some condition that's in place, something that you have to do so that God keeps you in his good favor. You're doing it in response to grace. That means legalistic or pharisaical obedience it's based on this idea. A lot of times, if I'm a good person and I do all these things, then God will bless me and will give me a good life and he'll answer my prayers and take me to heaven. Friends, that's not going to happen. That's not how it works. You're going to be living a good life or what you perceive as a good life, and when something goes wrong, you'll feel like God's not answering your prayers. And you say, God, I lived a good life. Where are you? What's going on? And the reason that many of us are ready to give up in those moments, or the reason maybe that you have given up, is because the way that you view the Christian life is that you've got to earn God's grace. You don't already have it. But grace, what Jesus is saying this morning, is actually the very thing that creates things like peace and hope, especially in the midst of tragedy. But grace also creates, I think Jesus is saying this, an inward resting. Right? The Pharisees were called white tombs. Did you know that? And that was because on the outside, the tombs would be painted in white. But you guys know what's inside a tomb. It's not bright. It's not white. It's dead. It's dark. He was saying that on the outside, you're doing all these great things, but inside, you're filled with pride. You're filled with yourselves. Here's what Jesus is saying. He is confronting us with this question. Are you motivated in your obedience from fear and pride and insecurity and trying to prove yourself to yourself or others? Or is it joy and gratitude? See, if you believe the gospel, if you believe what we just talked about, what Jesus has done in our place for us that we could not do for ourselves, and you've been changed by the knowledge of Christ's fulfillment of the law, friends, you get that righteousness from Jesus. Your sin is exchanged for that righteousness. You receive that righteousness, and that's why, by the way, your righteousness can exceed that of the Pharisees or the scribes. Because your righteousness is creating a spirit of rest. Because your significance and meaning in life is coming from Jesus. The good news of the gospel is that Jesus redeems our failure through his gospel. So what we're really talking about today is this. The gospel is, yes, a truth to be believed. It is the good news of Jesus' victory over sin and death and Satan through his perfect life, substitutionary death on the cross, and glorious resurrection from the grave. We are not reconciled to God through our efforts, through our record, through our law keeping. But we are reconciled to God through Christ's efforts. So, Christians who trust in Christ for their justification with God instead of their own moral character or commitment or performance are true Christians. But we're also saying this. The gospel, yes, is a truth to be believed, but it is also a truth that creates something. As we move more deeply into the gospel, as we experience it and explore all of the beautiful and amazing ways that the gospel can be applied to our life, it begins to create things like hope and peace and freedom. And we find even in the midst of tragedy, even in the midst of real difficulty, we are flourishing in the way that God intends. And this is what this has to do with the value of the gospel here at Mercyview. We've talked a lot about how the gospel affects us individually, but before we close out here this morning, we need to draw it out a bit more just to think about this value. We said earlier that in many ways, the value that sits underneath all of our values here at Mercyview is what we're talking about this morning. It's the gospel. But to expand what we just said, we desire here at Mercyview to see the application of the gospel press through everything that we do here. We desire to see individually, but also corporately, this to be true. We want to see gospel doctrine create gospel culture here at Mercyview. Gospel doctrine and gospel culture do not coexist by chance. The doctrine creates and sustains the culture. The way that we live together in this church grows out of what we believe together. So the gospel must land on each of us personally. You and I must believe what we've talked about this morning for ourselves, first and foremost. But the gospel also creates a new kind of community, a gospel culture called a church. And the church is ground zero for the new kind of community that Christ is creating in the world today. We want to be about that here. We want to be about that gospel centrality here at Mercyview. It is not enough for us to ask, does our church just teach gospel doctrine? And that's important. But we must also ask, is our church culture clearly aligned with that gospel doctrine? Friends, it is possible, and this happens in many churches, to unsay by our practical church culture what we say in our official church doctrine. Pastor and preacher Ray Ortlund says it this way: the test of a gospel-centered church is its doctrine on paper plus its culture in practice. See, when the doctrine is clear and the culture is beautiful, I believe the church will be powerful. That is our prayer here at Mercyview. But friends, there are no shortcuts to getting there. Without the doctrine, the culture will be weak. Without the culture, the doctrine will seem pointless. Here's Ortlund again. If by God's grace we hold the two together, gospel doctrine and gospel culture, people of all ages will more likely come to our churches with great joy. It is more likely that they will think, here is the answer I've been looking for all my life. And it won't be just that others will say that. We will all say that because the gospel we know is the answer. We want in on that. And those that are looking in at this culture here at Mercyview go, man, I want in on that. Gospel doctrine plus gospel culture equals a power that is unignorable. And that is our prayer here at Mercyview. May it be so here. Let me pray for us.